Hello and most welcome to lecture 1640 of the Heidegger series. I've been freely discussing the book and its contents, Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner by Paul Johnston, and it served as an inspiration to take it to some other area. Here in my hometown we had the privileged couple of months ago to be visited by an American Indian from the Lakota tribe in South Dakota. He came here to show that his language is more quantum physical. The Lakota language shares many traits with other American Indian languages. And one astonishing feature is there are no nouns, no pronouns, no adverbs, and hardly any adjectives. Neither any pronouns, I, you, me. Despite these astonishing odd features, it's a working language that serves its language game purpose to the fullest. It is for us hard to imagine being able to communicate without nouns. And I will see in this lecture how that fits with the explanations and theories of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who said that different languages are different life worlds altogether. And that language is use in the strictest possible sense. We asked our visitor from Dakota how it was to learn English. He encountered it first at the young age of 6 to 7. I remember when he was asked the question, that his face got an almost terrified expression. And he said, when I realized that there were nouns, that what was lively and active in the world had become dead objects, without movement or inner life thrust. It was, he said, like the whole world had become stale and gloomy, static, non-moving. When I heard that, I came to think about Wittgenstein's understanding that there is a misuse in language, or a misunderstanding of great magnitude, which confuses us about the true structure and workings of the very language we use on an everyday basis in human affairs, communication, thinking, perception. And I wondered, maybe it is that this, as the Indian said, this staticness, this deadness, is the misunderstanding of the true working, or the true workings of language. Which makes language an after image, an after effect, like what often is called the representational fallacy. The same illusion that had earlier cast a spell on Wittgenstein himself for many decades, which was so clearly expressed in his magnum opus, the Tractatus, a book whose understanding he later came to abandon after a long time of reconsideration in his sabbatical time between his big book, the Tractatus, and the many years until he came to the conclusions that were, for instance, expressed in philosophical investigations of a much later time. A time that he had spent, among other fascinating places, in a fjord in Norway, working as a school teacher in the Austrian countryside, and talking with a Vienna group of logical positivists he came to a altogether different understanding. And in philosophical investigations, he turns his attack to the man or him, that person being himself, his earlier self. But maybe even more revealing, he also used Saint Augustine, the church father and saint, and his explanation on how a child learns language. According to Saint Augustine, we learn language by ostensive indication. Somebody points at an object and say the word, for instance, plant. That is learning by ostension, which of course happens. Wittgenstein looked closer into this rather reasonable proposal of Saint Augustine and showed that in order to understand the ostensive finger, to understand what it means to point at something, language already needs to be completely established. Otherwise, you wouldn't know to look for the finger, the hand, and you wouldn't understand what the direction was if you even saw it as a direction. That you're supposed to follow the finger all the way somewhere else. And then you don't know what in the pointing it's referring to. Color, shape, weight, smell. It's far from clear what an object should be. And to know what the thing is, all the background needs to be there somehow, at least quite a lot. And thereby Wittgenstein questioned something that had been more or less unquestioned for centuries, millennia. Ostensive definitions are far from clear, and it would be highly unlikely that any child learned any more than a few dozen words by ostension. Wittgenstein means that the life world in total, what we do in that world, is what determines the life world's conditions. And that would be different depending on history, what they do, how they are, all their historical billions of different features will be present in deciding the workings of a word. And I think it's a good example when one comes to the understanding that there are even languages that do not have nouns. That is in itself something impossible to understand. Wittgenstein said, I hope this is a quote from him, that if a lion were to be able to speak, we wouldn't understand it, no matter what, because his life world is so different. And this points to that meaning is not some mystical general substance like ether that invigorates the words, and makes it possible from that a word can go from its sound, which is supposed to be hollow in the current tradition, and that word somehow refers to something else by meaning and connects to as he said, a dead world of objects. Almost like a museum, where you have things almost, well, I wouldn't say almost even, but without context, and there are some referral remarks to what they resemble, what they are. Maybe there's an artifact from Egyptian antiquity. That sort of stale reference is an illusion that captured us, and a picture that took our understanding and reduced it to only representational of something else. Of course, in certain conditions and with certain words, like the extensive definition, it can be representative or be able to represent something, but it's highly unusual. Language games or language do not have a common thread, a common demeanor, which would be meaning, intention or extension, or even representation. Such a thing wouldn't have a place in an ordinary life world, where practical things were to be done. Maybe previously in the Indian village you wanted to go hunting, you asked a person not for representation, it was an act of wanting to do something. In this interconnectedness, then language can be, where purposes and the doings and the outside is constantly present. Language is not in isolation, in an incubator, cut out from the real world, existing in its own. This is very similar to the private language argument. It's only that the inner in that is shown, not to be isolated from the rest of all interrelatedness, connections, all that matters to a society, a tribe. You would like to do something. It's impossible for an isolated innerness to come about. It wouldn't have a purpose. What would it do? If I ask somebody, maybe, do you see that building on the other side, which is beige? I am not asking if you have a sense impression inside of you, which has inside it beigeness, squareness, maybe ugliness, it's not a nice building. No, I really want to know if you can see it. Maybe the shades are down too much, or maybe I'm worried about my eyesight. It could be anything, but it has a purpose. Never ever would I ask about somebody's inner experience. We are living beings that do things. We cooperate, and their differences are bound to be immense. One example the Indian gave was when he was talking about other tribes living far away. And he said something to the extent, there our language would not work. In their environment, which is so radically different, with a different background, different doings. He said, language is connected to the terrain, to the ground, to the sound. One of the chapters in Paul Johnston's book is taking up the musicality of language. How different words have a completely different ring to them. And even if they could be completely exchanged by Google Translator or a thesaurus or something similar, they are absolutely different in their effects. They sound different. They do different things, although the extension and intention, the meaning is almost exactly the same. This is often ignored today. You do no longer, like a poet, weigh a word carefully to know if it's the just word, the perfect word, the suitable one, because of its in connection to everything else, exactly how it sounds. Something that cannot be described by description. That cannot be reduced to something else, like a representation. Cannot say that the tone of that voice is so or like that. It's unique, and it's not generalizable to all languages. The uniqueness is within the very particular. As here, different languages, different life worlds, different nature, different atmosphere, colors, feelings. All is different. And it's a connectedness with the ground. It is in there, sharply, exactly, and sometimes it seems that it is unclear or blurry, but it serves its still exact purpose in that very moment we use it. And that is the important thing. The use of the words, like they fit exactly the spot for this is how it was built from the beginning, at the very early start. Questions maybe? Let me just say that the Indian language taught me a lesson, and hearing about it and seeing that even the way of gesticulating is mysteriously different. The sense of the body, the presence, all absolutely different and idiosyncratic. Far from the generalizable and universalized model of human language, for instance, presented by the proponents of universal grammar as Noam Chomsky, or the defenders of an idea that there is a generalizable thing called intention, or meaning, or for that matter, object. It's ridiculous now to say, oh, those are all objects. They don't share anything. Objects. It's an object. And it all started, so to speak, when this Indian at the very young age of 6 or 7 learned that there was such a thing as dead an object. And that ghastly feeling of, he said it was almost a smell to it of staleness. It was a past thing, no longer vibrant, no longer a verb, so to speak. So I say thank you very much for your patience, and have a very pleasant night or day, whatever it is where you are. Thank you very much.